Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this presentation. I wish that I could see and meet all of you in person. However, I'm really grateful to the Indiana Music Teachers Association for organizing this virtual state conference so that we can all learn from each other and share our resources and teaching experiences. Today, we will explore aspects of imagination from the scientific and practical perspective as it relates to pedagogy, with emphasis on the little-known phenomenon called aphantasia. The first part of the presentation will explain a bit about aphantasia and what it means for us as pedagogues. Then we will go through some common teaching approaches for addressing musicality-related topics and discuss how effective these approaches are for certain students. I wanted to start by introducing myself. My name is Timothy Stephenson, and I am a doctoral candidate at Indiana University, where I have served as an associate instructor in the secondary piano department and on faculty at IU's Young Pianists program. A combination of my own musical development and my experience with piano students at the undergraduate level here at IU has sparked my interest in unpacking our conceptions of musicality. Personally, I struggle with terms such as talented, musical, and other vague adjectives that I often hear used to describe students with a seemingly deep connection to the music that they are playing. And as a pedagogue, I hope to dispel the idea that there are students who will just never be able to achieve that desirable, quote-unquote, musical performance. As a result of my time at IU, much of my research has been centered on the teaching of musicality to adult students. Today's presentation is an offshoot of that research, and it focuses on visualization and auditory imagery as it applies to teaching musicality. It is my hope that the topics that we cover today will help me and my fellow teachers identify the brain functions that we are asking our students to perform when we address musicality-related topics in lessons. Together, we can come up with eclectic practices for teaching musicality that will resonate with students who may not possess strong visual and auditory imagery. Throughout this presentation, if you find any of this interesting or you want to share some of your ideas and experiences, I would love to hear from you. This is part of my ongoing research, so I'm always interested in learning from my colleagues and developing the best practices for teaching musicality. So, what is aphantasia? Well, to answer that question, we are going to start with a little activity. Take a look at this apple. It's quite beautiful, isn't it? If you're hungry right now, you may even want to take a bite. So take a good look at this apple and notice all of the details. Now, I want you to close your eyes and think about the image that you just saw. Can you make it appear in your mind? Can you see the beautiful red shine? What about the vivid green leaf? You can probably even make the apple really big or small, or multiply it so you're in a whole orchard of apples. You may even be able to see it without closing your eyes at all. Okay, open your eyes. So here is what it looks like when someone with aphantasia tries to picture the apple. That's right, nothing at all. Are you confused right now? That's okay. Just bear with me. So aphantasia only recently made an appearance in scientific literature, with the first case study in 2010. The term itself was coined in 2015 and has subsequently been used to describe persons with no internal visualization capabilities whatsoever. In other words, a blind imagination. Even though it is technically new on the scene, in the 1800s, Francis Galton described a similar phenomenon. In his writings, he reports asking his scientific-minded colleagues to picture their breakfast tables and describe what they could remember. Apparently, they were bewildered by the idea that anyone could picture anything in their minds at all, and suggested that he was a bit eccentric. Interesting, right? So aphantasia has been around for a long time. Don't worry, I won't go into the nitty-gritty scientific jargon today, but there are a few important things about the scientific findings that are vital for our discussion about teaching musicality. Firstly, Even though the research is still in its infancy, there have been enough studies with thousands of test subjects to suggest that the results are reliable. With a combination of subjective reports using the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire and analysis of subjects' performance on imagery tasks, such as rotating an object and describing its features, researchers were able to measure brain activity with an fMRI machine and reach a few concrete conclusions. One of the most interesting findings was that the subjects' performances on imagery tasks were not impaired by a lack of visualization capabilities. This means that people without the ability to visualize were still able to perform the same tasks as those who were able to visualize, using critical thinking and problem-solving areas of the brain. In other words, it's not enough to assume that everyone has the same abilities just because they can achieve the same tasks. Another important thing to mention is that scientists have concluded that aphantasia is a result of a complete lack of low-level sensory function. This means that the ability to visualize for people with aphantasia cannot be learned or developed. Research suggests that about 2.7% of the population has aphantasia. In the United States alone, that's 8,856,000 people. That's a lot of people. Another interesting concept that has casually been termed total aphantasia is the idea that in addition to a lack of visualization, people in this category are also unable to hear anything inside of their heads or engage in internal dialogue, among other things. Basically, this means that there are people with no imagination whatsoever, and the implication for musicians is enormous. There isn't currently research on what I call the deaf inner ear that I have discovered, but psychologist Dr. Andrea Halpern at Bucknell University has done extensive studies gauging levels of auditory imagery, which is sometimes described synonymously with audiation. And we know that this particular ability is on a scale of some sort. You may not have a student who has aphantasia or total aphantasia, but internal visual and auditory imagery are definitely different experiences for everyone. And it's safe to say that many people, including some of your students, may not rely on visualization or auditory imagery at all in order to achieve regular or musical tasks, because they just can't. So, if we recognize that a large portion of the population might be using critical thinking and problem-solving portions of the brain to achieve visual or musical tasks, and we accept that this is a consequence of how their brains are wired, therefore it can't be developed, then it is useful for us to take a good look at how we teach musicality, using methods that do not rely only on visual or auditory ability. Now, I am not a cognitive scientist or an expert on music cognition, but I have been studying music for 20 years, and after learning about aphantasia earlier this year, several things just fell into place for me. After years of feeling as though I was missing something that my fellow music colleagues had, I realized that it was because I actually have aphantasia, and it's the total kind too, so I've never been able to hear anything inside of my head. In fact, until this year, I always thought that that was just a figure of speech, but apparently not. When I analyzed my own teaching, I saw that I subconsciously tended to find ways to teach musical topics without relying solely on visual or auditory imagery, and it is my hope that this research and some of my own insights can help you too. So let's dive in. In 2015, Michael Forrester and Emma Borthwick-Hunter parsed out 3 different dimensions of musicality. In the first category, we have musical competencies. This is technique and musical knowledge, and it is what we spend a great deal of time teaching to our young students. This includes technique, dynamics, articulation, and basically all fundamental musical knowledge. It's the toolbox that we provide our students with, so it's really important that we get it right. In the second category, we have musical intelligence, and this is what most people traditionally call musicality. It's the ability to apply the musical skills from the first category, whether intelligently or instinctually, to musical performance. We teach musical styles, oral skills, form, music theory, and more to empower our students to play their music with the highest level of understanding. In the Faber series, students are encouraged to improvise. making their own decisions about how to implement dynamics and articulations to the music. They are also introduced to the concepts of question and answer very early, in the hopes that students will learn to apply this in later, more complex music. In this category, we move from learning the tools to applying them skillfully. And finally, there's communicative musicality, and this is the category that concerns us today. This highest level of musicality attempts to address that artistic quality of music that we hope to inspire all of our students with during the course of their musical education. In pedagogy, this concerns teaching our piano students how to express themselves through music or how to manifest extra musical ideas. Now we're going to look at some specific topics and strategies for teaching communicative musicality that many of us utilize on a regular basis. Depending on the age and level of your students, you may be using variations on what I will describe today, but I hope that I can offer a bit of insight into what aspects of these approaches rely heavily on auditory imagery and/or visualization. This is definitely not an exhaustive list at all, and as we are all wonderful music teachers, we should have all kinds of tools in our teaching toolbox. But I pulled out some of the relevant strategies that I think are used most often. We'll start with what I think to be the most straightforward, such as singing, using imagery, and putting words to music. Then we will move to topics that require more abstract thinking, such as tone production, memorization, and mental practice. So I would like to start with the long line. Okay, so the long line is an age-old idea. We pianists need to convey the beautiful, endless line, like a long-winded soprano might deliver from the opera stage. So what might we say to our students to get them to do this? Of course, there are lots of things we could say, but here are just a few that I've heard pretty often. Just hear the line in your head. Sing the line, then play what you just sang. And my personal favorite, we need to hear the long line. Unfortunately, all of these rely very heavily on auditory imagery and would be virtually impossible for a student with aphantasia or low auditory imagery ability. But in the discussion of long line, we can't do any better than singing because that is exactly what we are trying to imitate on the piano. But if you ask your students to sing a line in their music, or if you sing it with them, then ask them to play it the way they sang it. It requires them to recreate what they just sang in their minds. Pairing singing with the fingering of the passage on a hard surface will allow them to more effectively transfer the singing line to their playing. They can make a practical connection between the nuances of singing to the physical act of playing without relying heavily on the inner hearing of that line. Another approach would be to focus on the technical aspects of playing a long line, such as legato and dynamics. However, we have to ask ourselves whether this practical, skills-based approach is really bridging the gap between musical intelligence and communicative musicality, as described earlier. Somehow, our students have to relate the music to an extra musical experience, emotional or otherwise. I like to tell my students to breathe out slowly while they are playing a long line, as if the breath was feeding the right-hand melody. Again, I'm pairing the concept with something physical. Imagery is probably the most widely used strategy for conveying ideas that somehow cannot be explained with practical musical skills or knowledge. Let's start with an example from Debussy's Image. I'm going to play a little bit for you, and I apologize because the piano's out of tune. For this piece, we might describe a beautiful water scene, like the one pictured here. The light reflects off of the water, and the ripples create the undulating colors that we are trying to imitate on the instrument. So what are we trying to do when we use vivid imagery to describe music like this? In effect, we are setting the scene for our students to embody the character of the image that we are laying out. We are using imagery to access emotion and reaction, to allow the imagination to run with it. So, the goal is to access emotion and reaction to create character. And imagery is normally a great way to do that. However, students with aphantasia or low visualization capabilities will have a very difficult time relating to this unless there is a situational component to it. By that I mean something that the student has experienced or can experience during the lesson. So for example, I might ask my student if they have ever been to a lake or an ocean during a sunset and seen how the light reflects off of the water. Can you remember how that felt to be there? What was the water doing? Was it moving or was it just staying still? I'm using imagery, but I'm asking specific questions about my student's experience, which I will then transfer to some physical and sound-based recreation of that experience. And that's the really important part. We are no longer relying entirely on imagery. For example, if the water is moving, then we need to move as well, both physically and with how we play the music. In this particular piece, one might think of a figure-8 sort of movement that goes up and down the keyboard. So the imagery is being used to create something physical that can be manifested at the instrument. Now, there are lots and lots of ways to do this, but I have witnessed many a masterclass and lesson where the teacher paints a beautifully vivid picture of a scene to try and get the student to embody a certain character that is necessary for the music, while the student, as inspired as they may be, is completely unable to grasp the meaning. And this is just one example. With my younger students, I enjoy Faber's approach in some of the theory book exercises where the student is asked to draw the shape of the line that they hear. This is another use of imagery, and it can be effective for explaining contour of line to students with aphantasia because it has a motor skill and creative component. This physical and conceptual aspect can be readily applied to piano playing without relying entirely on imagery. Some of the most effective tools that I've found for teaching musicality-related concepts to students involve speech. Putting words to music is related to our earlier discussion of singing. However, it eliminates the anxieties of singing that many of our older students have. For me, I find that students between ages 10 and 16-ish really don't benefit from forcing them to sing when they don't want to. Again, if we ask students to create words for their music, there should be some other component that goes along with it. If they can play and say the words, that's great. For me, assigning lyrics to the music is effective because the words themselves, if chosen carefully, can have some sort of emotional content that automatically transfers to the music. Related to this, creating a narrative is another tool that some teachers use to encourage students to create a meaningful interpretation at the piano. I have found this to be probably the most effective tool for students that struggle with the traditional visual and auditory approaches. But we have to be careful to steer clear of the vague, this is happy, or this part is really sad sort of narratives. Using a story is very similar to imagery, so when we do this, we have to make sure that we are observing our students carefully. The story has to speak to them. So I have found that using situations from their lives, emotional reactions that they can tangibly identify, or physical actions that they can perform in the lesson are the most effective. This will open doors for the student to engage whatever mental processes work for them. You can explore emotions, speech, physicality, and more, all within the framework of this musical story that you are helping them to create. The next three concepts are a bit more advanced, so I just want to briefly go over why some of the traditional techniques might not resonate with students who have low visualization or auditory imagery ability, without going into too much detail. The first is a tricky one, which is tone production. So how do we teach this? For me, the first step is to teach the student what good tone sounds like. Of course, everyone has different opinions about this, and I'm not going to debate any of that here. There are even arguments that tone itself on the piano does not really exist. But anything that we ask our students to do that requires recreating the sound in their head prior to playing at the instrument is going to be very difficult for some students. Listening to recordings, for example, is useful for providing inspiration to students, but is not necessarily effective for helping them develop good tone at the instrument. This applies also to live performances. You can play for them and ask them to imitate, but again, this relies heavily on rote and auditory imagery, so they will likely be unable to reproduce the sound once the lesson is over. It is certainly not enough to tell students that they just need to listen better or develop their ears. And saying you need to hear the note before you play it really means nothing to a student with aphantasia or low auditory imagery. In the lesson, the most effective thing that we can do to develop good tone without relying on auditory imagery is to give our students tangible exercises and feedback on what good and bad tone are. We are helping them to learn what is desirable and what is not. So once we cover the basics of what we would like to hear, warm, indirect, open, singing tone, we should ask for feedback often. What kind of sound did you just make? Was it a warm tone? Why? Why not? How can we make it better? Most likely the answer will be, I don't know. So now is your chance to bridge the gap, to encourage them to listen and make transfers between their technique and the sound that they hear. It is equally important for students to know what undesirable tone sounds like. So it is useful to make them play harshly and directly sometimes so they know what it feels like and what it sounds like in the moment while they're doing it. And of course, sometimes we want harsh tone for certain composers. For a more practical matter, when we are teaching our students how to memorize, there are so many different approaches. It has been studied at length and is examined by articles like Performing from Memory by Robert Chafin, Topher Logan, and Kristen Begosh. In it, the authors identify different functional memories: auditory memory, motor memory, visual memory, emotional memory, structural memory, and linguistic memory. We won't go into specific definitions of each, but I have put a brief description up on the PowerPoint. If you have made it this far in the presentation, you will likely be able to figure out which of these is not effective for the student with aphantasia. In my personal experience, I rely heavily on structural, motor, and emotional memory, since I'm not able to utilize auditory or visual memory. So in my teaching, I encourage my students to be very familiar with the form of the pieces that they are playing, and we spend time talking about how to use structure to help with memory. I sometimes also have my students assign emotional content to each section. This article also hits on two broad approaches that the authors describe as associative chaining and content addressable memory. Fancy words. But basically, this is the difference between stream of consciousness playing, where the performer knows what comes next from what is happening now, and mental mapping, which is when the performer basically has a blueprint of how the piece goes in its entirety. I have found that this second approach is effective for both myself and my students. It involves assigning performance cues for specific sections and relying on critical thinking areas of the brain. I would encourage you to read Chafin's article, which I will cite at the end of the presentation. It is really fascinating and provides insight on the process of memorization. Finally, we have mental practice, and it is a technique that we encourage many of our students to do often. When discussing mental practice with my students, I try to keep in mind that there are several definitions and uses. For many people, mental practice means playing through the piece in their heads or imagining the score from start to finish. But students with aphantasia or low auditory imagery are not able to do this. So when discussing mental practice, I ask my students basic questions about whether or not they can hear the piece in their heads in order to gauge what type of mental practice will be most effective for them. If they seem a little uneasy about it, I will ask them to play through passages of their pieces physically on a hard surface, or go through the piece away from the piano and try to remember the sequence of characters or emotions for each section. instead of trying to imagine in their heads the act of playing the piece. Well, that is all I have for today, and I hope that it gives us a pretty good starting point for addressing students with aphantasia or low auditory imagery ability. I have listed here some of the research that I referenced throughout the presentation regarding aphantasia, musicality, studies in auditory imagery, and memorization. So check those out if you want to learn more. While some of what we talked about today might be intuitive to you as a teacher, I hope that this presentation will encourage you to think about how the techniques you are using are resonating with your students, because all of our internal experiences are different. I'm sure that you have lots of creative approaches for teaching musicality as well, and I would love to hear about them and how you think they fit into this discussion about visualization and auditory imagery. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you would like to share your insights or to ask me any questions, I would love to hear from you. You can find me on social media, or you can email me at timjstep@iu.edu. Thank you again to the IMTA for hosting me and for putting on this virtual state conference. I hope you are all staying safe and healthy. Thank you.